Tuesday, September 11th. Bob Herzog is on camera. We're interviewing Mary Ann Kuk. I'm Cheryl Revkin. We're at the Neighborhood Council office. Okay. So hi. Hi. Why don't you start out by telling us how long you've been in Silver Lake?
Okay. I moved to Silver Lake in 1975. And before moving to Silver Lake, I knew nothing about it, that it even existed. And I was looking for a house to buy, and my then boyfriend, now husband, said, "Have you ever been to Silver Lake?" And I said, "No." He said, "Well, let's go." And I was then living in Larchmont in an apartment, and I wanted to be closer to downtown to cut my commute.
What were you doing? What was your job?
I was in marketing at Union Bank and Coopers and Libran. I was a corporate person. Anyway, so one look at the trees and the lake and all of that. It was just, this is it. So I bought my first house in Silver Lake in 1975.
With your then boyfriend?
Of course, it's more complicated.
Oh, okay, all right.
I had a friend who lived in San Francisco, and neither of us could afford to buy a house on our own. And he wasn't really interested in maintenance and owning a house. He just would like to have a little tax deduction and an investment. So we bought the first house together.
Where was that?
On Angus in Silver Lake. And then on Valentine's Day, 1976, my boyfriend and I got married.
Oh.
Yeah, so romantic. And been married ever since. So I've been a 32-year married person.
What's your husband's name?
His name is Michael Clifton, and he's an architectural designer. And he actually designed the house that we're now living in.
Why don't you give us the address of that house, because it's really very famous.
Oh, okay, yes.
Everybody loves your
landmark.
house.
It's at 2011 West Silver Lake Drive at the corner of Balmer. And it's the very tall Santa Fe style one.
Love that house.
Yeah.
You know what you did that I thought was so cool? You invited the neighborhood to come see it because it became a landmark as a structure. And then I remember the big banner come to our open house, and I had something else to do that day, and I regretted that because I love that the Adobe Santa Fe.
Yes. Well, we'll probably do that again because we're in the midst of, believe it or not, it's been 20 years.
I know, time goes fast.
And I have several funny stories that in having your paperwork here, I thought of some very funny stories. We bought that lot, which is a very small lot, in about 1975 or 6, intending to build on it someday, and met the neighbors because, as you may remember, we share the driveway. The city street actually extends up to that eucalyptus tree on paper. So the people who live on Balmer, with whom we share the driveway, had built that house in the late 50s or early 60s. And they had a permit from the city to build a driveway over them. So when we bought the lot, we went over and introduced ourselves and told them we were going to build a house. And they were going to lose their view from the bedroom. They weren't going to lose their front view, but they were going to lose their view from the bedroom. And that was okay. They had had it for 25 years, and that was okay. And they were older. Well, time goes by. We couldn't afford to build it then. We had these plans drawn by a real architect, not my husband, and then the interest rates went up, whatever. We couldn't afford to build it. And then we accumulated some more money. We bought and fixed and sold a couple houses or something, I don't remember. And unrolled the plans, and we decided we didn't like those plans at all. 10 years had gone by or something, and it was a 10-year-old house, and why would we build a 10-year-old design? My recollection was it was something like Sea Ranch, which was very popular at the time in the 60s. So we redesigned the house and built what's there 20 years ago. So we were disappointed that we hadn't done it sooner because we really liked our neighbors. But unfortunately, by then, they were very old and both very deaf. And it was impossible to carry on a conversation with them. And we were really sad. because we really liked them. They were 60s radicals. Both went to Cal, as did my husband. So, we had all that in common. So, we just didn't have much of a neighborly, we had a friendly relationship, but it wasn't as nice as it would have been had all this happened earlier. So, ultimately they died and the house was sold to this nice young couple. And we went over and introduced ourselves, and we were walking together back up the driveway to the house, and I said, "You realize, Michael, that when we built this house, the former owners were the old folks next door. And we're now the old folks next door."
Right.
And they've had a baby, and and the whole thing starts all over again, which made me recall another funny story. When we moved into our first house on Angus, we were unpacking and a knock on the door, and the lady from across the street showed up with a cake or something and welcomed us to the neighborhood. And she said, "Oh, and I so hope you're planning to have children, because they're threatening to close Ivanhoe
Ivanhoe School?
because attendance was so low."
Oh, hard to believe.
This is how things change. And I told her, I said, "No, children is not on our plan. We're just not going to have, we're planning to have kids." And she was very disappointed. Well, obviously, things change, and now we've got a baby boom.
Yeah. Ivanhoe's overflowing.
Overflowing, right. Yes, anyway. All right, so those are my very funny stories I remembered about.
Why don't you tell us where you were born and when?
Okay. I was born in 1946 in LaPorte, Indiana, which is 60 miles east of Chicago. And just this year, I went back for the first time in 35 years probably, just to visit the town and show Michael. We had done a hippity hop trip to Chicago and New York and stuff. And we moved. My mother announced after a very severe winter, because we're virtually on Lake Michigan and had very cold winters, that she was moving to California and that we were welcome to join her, but that it was not a discussion. Well,
how old were you?
I was 15, and I was thrilled with the idea. I mean, Spin and Marty and
Route 66.
Hollywood and Route 66 and all those things were going on television at that time. So I was thrilled. So she and I came out first, and then my dad followed, and my brother at the time was in. At that time, my brother was in the Army. So I said very jokingly to my mother, "Now are you going to give him our new address?"
Was he drafted for Vietnam? Or?
No, that was before that. He was being mustered out at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So that would have been 62, I think. And so he ended up having to stay in the Army a little longer because of that event in history. But no, he had joined the Army. He didn't know what to do. Typical 18-year-old boy. Didn't know what to do.
Well, why don't we shift a little bit to Silver Lake when you came here. What are your first recollections, I guess, of the community, and what made you kind of like Silver Lake and get involved the way you have in Silver Lake?
When we bought the first house, we had intended to buy it and fix it over a year or two and sell it, and do that several times. And that was one way to accumulate some money. I was a modestly paid administrative assistant type person. So it had taken me 5 years to save $5,000. And so my husband always liked to build houses, and that's what he was doing. Not in Silver Lake, but elsewhere, wherever he could find the right lot. So I didn't have much particular interest in the community as a community, because I was working full-time, and then we were fixing up houses full-time. So none of that happened until we moved into our existing house, which would be March 1987. And not 2 months after that happened, the DWP announced that they were going to build a filtration plant on the meadow and cover Ivanhoe Reservoir. And
the purpose
for
these-
water quality. That they had said that they had to do this to all the open water reservoirs in the city. And we had just moved in, our dream house, and I was not about to go down without a fight, because the style of water filtration plant at that time looked like a refinery. Things are changed now in 20 years, and were they to continue to make that proposal, it would be a different design. But at that time, it was an industrial style, which totally didn't belong in Silver Lake, and certainly didn't belong across from my house. So my reaction was over my dead body, and that was kind of the beginning. And I had met Alita Hanger, who was one of the founders of the Silver Lake Residents Association, at a couple of community meetings. And then John Sloan, who was another founding member of SLRA, lived 2 houses up, kind of on the point. And we had occasion to chat with each other, either at meetings or something. Fairly soon after we moved in, they moved to Pasadena. He had retired. He was a longtime attorney. And so Sharon Flanagan, who was a neighborhood activist, had the same feeling about covering Ivanhoe. And that was from their house, that was their view, Ivanhoe. And so she started the Committee to Save Silver Lake's Reservoirs.
When you say Ivanhoe, you mean
The upper reservoir.
is called the Ivanhoe Reservoir?
Right, there are 2 reservoirs. The upper one is called Ivanhoe, and the lower big one is called Silver Lake. There was never any plan to cover Silver Lake. It was just too big. So that's why they're going to build a filtration plant. So, as I said, I had met Alita Hanger, and she had coaxed me into the Residents Association, and I attended some meetings, and I think she thought I had promise. She was very covetous of the Residents Association board, and all these years later, I know why. It's really important that you have people who are not necessarily of equal mind, but certainly of like mind, and who have kind of a nurturing feeling about these associations. It's always a very, with volunteers, as you know, all people, it's always a very tentative and tenuous relationship, because people get busy, people have a baby, people leave, retire, they get mad about some issue and say, that's it, I'm out. And maybe they were just looking for an issue to exit because they couldn't think of a good reason to quit. So anyway, she died, I don't know, it's got to be 10 or more years ago now.
This is Alice?
This is Alita Hanger.
Alita.
Yeah, and by then there was a new collection of people, and so there was some friction, not among me, with me, between the Committee to Save and the Residents Association, because the Residents Association had gotten formed over several issues, one of which was the shortening of Silver Lake Dam. And that was when they were going to rebuild it after the 70 Whittier earthquake. This was before my time, so I don't have the dates particularly right. Anyway, that was a big fight for the Residents Association to maintain that last 6 acres of water. And
so the Silver Lake Residents Association was formed in the early 80s? Or late 70s?
Yeah, late 70s.
And do you
Must
know,
have been, yeah.
Do you have any idea how big the membership was, or anything like that?
No.
But there was a kind of a solid board formed around this.
John Sloan would have lost 6 acres of his view, so he was highly motivated. I thought that was a funny kind of passing the torch. I was highly motivated. Anyway, they fought the fight, and again, this was before my time, so I don't know. I wasn't there in person, but this is what I understand. And so there seemed to be some kind of it's our fight, and I didn't get that. I thought we needed all the people. And I think that what happened was Sharon Flanagan met with Alita, and Alita had this aha moment where she saw that Sharon was so competent and would do a really good job fighting the fight. And Alita had already fought that fight. So I think that she came to terms with it in her own way. And then Sharon invited Alita to be on the board of the Committee to Save and vice versa. And so there was this commingling. And about that time, shortly after the Committee to Save was formed, I wasn't one of the founding members, but I joined, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 meetings in. And so that's how all of that happened.
So you were a member of the Silver Lake Residents Association, and then you moved up to being an officer and then the president?
Yeah, I served on the board and...
From what year? Well, let's see. You started in 1987?
Or so, 86, 87. Since we had moved into the house that I knew we were going to stay in, and it was done, I wasn't a fixer, I had time, and I liked the idea of being involved and really being part of the community, which is kind of a new thing. My parents never did anything like that. I had no role models. Yeah.
Wanted to ask you about that.
No, not at all activists, nothing. I have no idea how I turned out the way I did. And so I worked my way around all the offices and helped all the other officers and did the same thing with the Committee to Save. And when mediation began with the Department of Water and Power, I volunteered to be the alternate. Jim Bonner was the delegate and alternate. Yes, we had on mediation each of the residential groups in all of the reservoirs were able to choose 2 people, a delegate and an alternate, so that it wouldn't be overloaded with one reservoir, and other people could come and listen in. But
what do you mean, the other residents associations?
Yeah, and there are 10 reservoir communities, open reservoir communities: Stone Canyon, Hollywood, Elysian.
Around Los Angeles.
Yes.
I see.
Rowena, Silver Lake. I think that's it.
Echo Park.
No, Echo Park's not a drinking water reservoir. These are just drinking water
I
reservoirs. And the DWP had the same water quality improvement program, cookie cutter kind of laid out for all of them. And most of them have, with the exception of Elysian, have lots of people who live around them. So they have a fairly broad and deep constituency. And Elysian doesn't. Elysian's in the middle of the park, without any homes overlooking. So Sally Neubauer, who was then president of the Elysian Citizens Committee to Save Elysian Park, was the delegate for Elysian. And she actually buttonholed me at some other community meeting and said, this was before the coalition was formed, and I think just as Sharon was forming the Committee to Save. And as I recall, I put those 2 together because she needed a constituency, and it was kind of like the 3 Musketeers, all for one and one for all. And that's the whole idea of being a coalition, is that even though the Elysian issue wasn't the Stone Canyon issue, Stone Canyon would support Elysian and Elysian would support Stone Canyon. And that each of the reservoir communities left it to that reservoir community to make the decision about what would happen at the reservoirs.
At the various reservoirs.
At the various reservoirs.
Right. And does that coalition still exist?
Yes. Believe it or not, 20 years later, we're now on the last 3 projects: Silver Lake's project, Elysian's project, and Upper Stone Canyon's project. Rowena Reservoir was taken out of service, and an underground tank was built and a water feature on top. None of that would have happened without the coalition. What they would have had was a tank and a hole, and that would have been the DWP's idea of a solution to the problem.
So you were an alternate delegate.
Right,
And
so I
and-
attended the meetings, and then Jim got busy with work and asked if I could do it officially and permanently.
Oh.
So I moved into the delegate,
Mm.
and then several people served as alternates, and currently Ruth Ross is the alternate. And we still meet, we still mediate.
Let's stop the camera.
Okay.
All right.
So you moved up to the primary delegate position.
Right, and what it meant was attending the meetings and communicating with the various boards. And Sharon, Flanagan, and I, and Sally would go drive together to the meetings which were held at the Sportsman's Lodge, which was kind of a central location for people from all over the city. And going to and coming back, we got to talking, Sharon and I, about the end of mediation and what would happen. And we also kind of saw the handwriting on the wall that there would have to be a project at Silver Lake. And we thought, if there's a project or when there's a project at Silver Lake, there will need to be mitigation because of the environmental impact report and the damage to the community. So she and I thought it would be a good idea to see if we could convince the DWP to spend a little money at that time. This is before we had a project had been fleshed out at all. We were lower on the list because we weren't subject to the surface water treatment rule, because our sides weren't natural. Hollywood and Lower Stone Canyon were both high on the list because they had urban water runoff and anyway, you don't need to know that. Anyway, so she and I came up with kind of a scope of work, this is just driving back and forth, about doing a master plan, which would then ultimately be the mitigation for the project at Silver Lake. So that we wouldn't be hard pressed when they finally got around to doing Silver Lake to try to create some mitigation in 6 weeks. And yeah, and also it felt like we were kind of getting to the end of mediation. Now, how naive we were. And we thought, we want a product from all of this effort. I mean, there's a lot of meetings and a lot of very contentious meetings with the DWP. So we approached Jim Wixer, who was then the head of the water division, and said, Jim, this is what we think would be a good idea. And he thought so too. He was the guy who had just come from 20 years of litigation at Mono Lake, which the DWP lost royally. And they didn't want to do that again in the city of Los Angeles. And he was just appointed the new division head at that time. So he proposed mediation. That's how it all got started. And then the city council weighed in, and at that time it was Michael Wu and John Ferraro were our council members. And they both thought mediation was a good idea and supported it in the city council. Anyway, so where was I? Oh, master plan. So about 1998, the DWP committed $125,000, and we collectively, the DWP and the community reps, hired Mia Lair and Associates to do a master plan, and she did 3 workshops at Marshall High, and lots and lots and lots of people attended. And
wait, could you say who that company was again?
Oh,
It's a firm, right?
yeah, Mia Lair and Associates.
MIA?
MIALEHRER and Associates. She is a landscape architect and has some renown in the master plan. She was I think she's been awarded the Great Park down in Orange County, along with a whole cadre of people, not just her. And I think she did the Baldwin Hills, where they're as oil wells are drying out, the city is incorporating them into a big Baldwin Hills park. She was part of that. Anyway, so she did a beautiful job on the master plan. We do have a document, which is a marvelous description of what's going to happen at the reservoir.
Yeah, I think it's probably very important at this point in Silver Lake history to talk about how that master plan came about.
Okay.
How the community meetings were called and what the surveys were about.
Sure.
How it was all drawn up.
I'll do the best I can to remember. I may get some of the specific facts Originally, in Mia's original contract, we had 2 community workshops planned. And the first workshop was held, I want to say 1999. I could be off a year or two at Marshall High. And about 500 people showed up.
How did you promote the workshop?
Our newsletter, both newsletters, CSSLR's newsletter and SLRA, we had banners. I think we might have had a walking man. DWP may have sent out flyers. That was pre-internet, so certainly not email at that time. Word of mouth. Word of mouth travels like wildfire in Silver Lake. I can remember the day Trader Joe's announced they were going to put their Trader Joe's at the hub. It was like 4 minutes, I had 5 calls. Did you hear? Did you hear? It was so exciting.
So this was important to people.
Oh, yes.
Not just people who lived maybe around the reservoir.
Right, oh no.
But Silver Lake residents all together.
Absolutely, and we the organizers of all this, both the DWP didn't much care what the community wanted to do. They knew they would have to do mitigation. And it's just part of the budget when you're doing a big multi-million-dollar project. So it was from them, it was kind of whatever you guys want to do. And at that time, they were still, I think, thinking of covering Ivanhoe and building a filtration plant, although some years had passed, 10 years had passed, and the technology had changed some. And as they had been doing projects, they learned a lot about how to do this or that. So I think Hollywood, Rowena was probably done or nearly done, and Hollywood was underway. And Stone Canyon was in the works as far as design. And so, and I can't remember exactly what happened, but the primary desire or the goal of the master plan was to determine what the neighborhood wanted. At that time, we didn't know that the reservoir was going to be abandoned completely and they were going to go off site. That was that revelation or that development happened a long time after that.
So it was what would happen, whether there'd be a filtration plant there or not.
Or not,
and
right.
whether it would be people wanted it to be covered or not.
Right, the community didn't have a choice about covering if that was going to be what was going to happen. It was then how to deal with the cover. Rowena Reservoir dealt with the cover by having a water feature on top, and it was a fight all the way, but to get the DWP to do that. We didn't have any preconceived ideas about what this community would want. So both associations just worked really hard to have the process be a really open process and a listening forum, and then whatever resulted was going to be fine with us. Each individual member of the board may have had a feeling about what they wanted, and they were certainly willing and able to participate as part of the whole, but it was not a decision made by any of the associations at all. And I remember after the first workshop, Mia Lair came to us as kind of the debrief and said the thing that surprised her and her staff was how little the residents wanted. They didn't want a big, grand thing. They wanted access closer to the water. They would like a safe walking path. They wanted to preserve the kind of sylvan natural setting. If I remember, I don't know if they articulated, they didn't want what Rowena got. They wanted it to remain more natural. If I remember correctly, they didn't want lots of activities. They didn't want to make a recreational park in the rec and park sense. They wanted more just open space and passive recreation. And someone said in one of the meetings, which I thought was really articulate, that the moment you designate an open space with a ball, a baseball field, a soccer field, a golf course, it excludes everyone else. And I think of that, whoever said that, to have really summed up what we didn't want. We didn't want to be exclusive, we wanted to be inclusive. And when I drive by the Lasorda Field of Dreams frequently, it's always empty, except on those moments of time when somebody's reserved it to play a baseball game. It's not a particularly good baseball field because it's slopey. And
Where is that?
that's at the two free terminus, the two freeway terminus.
I know where it
Santa-
is.
Santa
Next to the
Teresa.
church.
Next
yes.
to the church, right. And it's so pointed out. And
I've never seen anyone using that.
yeah,
field.
people do, but not the way what the community envisioned Silver Lake to be if it were to be open to the public, and that is open to the public and not requiring reservations to play a baseball game or a soccer game or whatever. They didn't want bleachers, lights, bathrooms, organized play, buildings, all of the things that come with a recreation center. They thought and felt, at least if I remember correctly, that the rec center provided that. Building and bathrooms and a field and lights and no bleachers, but play areas and designated areas. Sometime in there also the dog park came to be an official dog park when Jackie Goldberg was our council member. So that was some years after the original mediation. So
there were two community meetings.
there were two workshops as part of the contract, and by the end of the second meeting, we all, the working group, decided that we really needed a third meeting. That a lot of people who attended the second workshop hadn't been to the first, and they had lots more input, and so they negotiated some more money, which is all it takes to follow the money.
From
the
DWP.
right. So we had a third community meeting, and then from that community meeting, the master plan was developed and written.
And who actually put that together? It was the
Bailey
woman
and
and
Associates, right? Part of the scope of the contract was that a product be developed, and the product in this case was the actual master plan. We all thought, the community all thought, that it would be helpful to get money from bond issues and park bond issues and grants and all that if we had a developed plan. And the details, as in all master plans, the details weren't fleshed out, but the details would get fleshed out as the phasing of it kind of came forth. At the time it was done, there wasn't any money to do anything. And just about that time, Scott Wildman came to some meeting or something, I now can't remember, but he said, well, maybe we could get some money from the state to at least to develop the plan a little more, or maybe to actually do one of the projects if the DWP is willing to let us do that. And I think, if I remember correctly, the first thing that people really wanted was a safe for walking, jogging path. And that
was phase one.
That was phase one, and the DWP, still at that time, so that would have been 5 years ago, 6 years ago, were planning to take the net out. It wasn't going to be open to the public in its kind of present condition. And I can't now remember what happened first, but the thinking of the DWP and their preliminary planning was that they were going to still cover Ivanhoe, but they would put some sort of water feature over it. They were going to leave Silver Lake alone and make it a little smaller and bury 2 tanks under the meadow. This would have been a horrendous project. 100 feet from lots of residences. It would probably be a 2-year project right on Silver Lake Boulevard. It was just that they would have to drain the reservoir for probably 4 years. It was just, the scale of it was just unbelievable for a community that's so close to the reservoir, that living so close to the reservoir. And the commuters who use Silver Lake Boulevard as their commute through the neighborhood. The traffic is horrible now. So anyway, we had the DWP sponsored one big meeting for the community with the 4 or 5 options that had been developed with the working group for a project, a water quality improvement project. And the least bad project was that one that I just described, with burying the tank, 2 tanks, making Silver Lake a little narrower, and burying 2 tanks in the meadow area and covering Ivanhoe. It was the least bad. Nobody said, "Oh wow, this is great." and at that same time, as fate would have it, while the negotiating team had always said, "Isn't there someplace off-site? Isn't there someplace off-site?" DWP owns lots of property. Couldn't it be somewhere else? This construction project was just going to be unbelievably horrible. We consoled ourselves by saying, "But we're going to get the master plan. I mean, that's going to be what's going to happen. All of those things that were fleshed out in the master plan would be the reward for suffering through. So the pain would be the construction project, and the gain would be the development and the implementation of the entire master plan." But at that same time, the DWP, I can't now remember, I think got back from Revkin Parks a piece of land adjacent to the LA River. This would now have been 2 or 3 years ago. And it was on the correct side of the LA River, and they began to think that maybe they could put the Silver Lake storage there. And it has to be at the right height for the water to flow. The DWP hates to use pumps. They pride themselves on using gravity as the flowing mechanism. And Silver Lake Reservoir actually feeds part of downtown Los Angeles and South LA, South Central LA. Silver Lake actually drinks Eagle Rock water. And the Eagle Rock Reservoir, which is hidden, was covered years and years and years ago. So
there was an option.
That option was on the table. They fleshed it out some more and then said that it was a doable deal. Now, the constituency who didn't like the idea was the LA River people, who had been looking at that site as a potential recharge for the LA River. So
What does that?
That where the LA River would fill it up, and then as it was raining, and then the water would refill the aquifer, which exists under Los Angeles. And as the water from the river was filtering through the soil, it would be cleaned. So the aquifer would be recharged. But the tricky part about that was right across the river was the old aquifer closed wells, because they were contaminated with heavy metals from the whole Lockheed World War II effort. And the state determined that it would be impossible to use that as a recharge. So the DWP presented that result to the LA River people, and while they weren't happy, they realized that it would probably take 20 years of technology in order for it to work, and they just couldn't seem to generate enough opposition. And then the DWP came up with some master plan money, which sweetened the deal for the LA River people. They could see the big picture, and as much as they wanted it, so that became the location for the Silver Lake storage. And that plan is moving forward. The EIR has been done and approved, and there will be some projects in Silver Lake. They're going to put a regulating station which regulates the pressure flow through the pipe. They're going to put a new river supply conduit under West Silver Lake Drive, but they'll tunnel, they won't trench, because it'll be quite far down and quite big. And there'll be some other little projects in Silver Lake, but nothing like what would have happened. So the good news is we don't get a construction project. The bad news is we don't get our master plan, because they have no mitigation. You know, did
The
that.
master plan had to be redrawn then?
No, the master plan has stayed the way it was, but the DWP wasn't gonna pay for it.
Oh, wasn't gonna pay for it. Okay.
That's right. Now, they've been doing a little bit and throwing us a bone now and again. And they did pay for the fence, the new fence on West Silver Lake Drive and up and over Armstrong. And they did relinquish some of the property on Armstrong in order to have our path go up and over the hill instead of along the street with a 10-foot graffiti wall. So all of that, it's been very generous of them to do that. And so.
But then it became the responsibility of the Committee to Save the Reservoir to find funds
Right.
to implement the master plan.
That's right.
I got it, okay.
That's right.
And that those funds could come from the state, they could be
County or
county,
city.
city, county, or state funds.
Right. And there's lots of money out there. You just have to have the right kind of project.
Mm.
And the Safe to Schools project provided some money from Scott Wildman, who then turned the baton over to Dario Frommer. And the first big chunk of money came from the state, $1.3 million. And then the city came up with some additional money, and we've been able to stretch that to complete phase 1, which is the West Silver Lake Drive path and up and over Armstrong path, and all of the planning and drawings for the Silver Lake Boulevard path. So there are 2 sections that are incomplete, and that is the Tesla Terrace, where people still walk in the street, and then around on Van Pelt. The hope is that we're going to be able to continue the path in back of the dog park and back of the rec center, so it follows along the toe of the dam. So those 2 sections will be the only unfinished for a complete circumnavigation. It's about 2.2 miles. So,
And then that's phase 1 and part of phase 2?
well, phase 1 is finished,
But the
but some of the
whole
money
path-
got shifted over to phase
Phase
2,
two,
which
okay.
is the Silver Lake Boulevard path. And then phase 3 will be the meadow and maybe Tesla. There's talk of building a boardwalk. There's reluctance to close half of the street on the part of the council member. So there's talk about building a boardwalk, and apparently the dam safety people in Sacramento are okay with that.
Where would the boardwalk be? Behind the current fence?
Behind the
inside?
current fence, but then
Where
the fence
where
would
the berm is, right.
Right. That's actually a dam. It's an earthen dam. There's a dam on the north and a dam on the south, and then a second dam on the south, which is Silver Lake Dam. The Silver Lake Dam was rebuilt in the 70s. That's when the reservoir was drained for years. And Ivanhoe has 2 earthen dams which were built, I think, in the 20s. And they test them regularly. And there is an issue a bit with the safety of them. But should there be an earthquake and the dams fail, all that would happen is it would slump. It wouldn't be a catastrophic event like if Silver Lake failed. So it's not an issue. And if it's not an issue for the state, then it's certainly not an issue for me. Because they're very fussy about that sort of stuff. So anyway, that's where the project is. The current plan is to have the meadow open sometime in the next year, since the Silver Lake Reservoir will be taken offline in 2010 is now the current thinking. It may shuffle a little later. It was originally 2008. And then Ivanhoe will be taken offline in 2012 or 14 when the completed project at the river is done. But they have to keep Ivanhoe as the pass-through. They will no longer use Silver Lake as a drinking water reservoir.
I have a question.
Yes.
Ivanhoe is at the top of a ridge. I don't
It's
know.
higher.
I mean, yeah, the Ivanhoe Dam is the one at Rowena, correct?
No, it's the one here.
No, it's at the north end of the reservoir.
Okay,
There's a
so
big-
it's split.
See it on there?
I know, I understand.
Yeah, there's
What
actually
do we call the one, though, the one with the water feature at
Rowena.
That's up here.
That's up here.
Okay, so
And then
that's,
this is Ivanhoe, and this is Silver Lake.
okay, I've got it.
Yeah.
I had Ivanhoe and Rowena mixed
Yes,
up,
and
sorry.
people do, right.
Mhm.
People don't think there are two. But there is a spillway, and the Ivanhoe Reservoir is actually used as a sand detention. You know those little minerals that you get in your water? Well, one of the things that they do to minimize that is water comes into Ivanhoe, and then they let it sit, and the minerals settle, and then it goes over the spillway into Silver Lake. So every once in a while, they have to drain Ivanhoe and scoop it all out because it's a certain amount of sand or minerals.
And then what will happen to the
Okay.
empty reservoirs?
Well, they won't be empty. The DWP has committed to keeping the reservoir water at the operating level, which is 440 or 450. That's feet above sea level, which is about where it is all the time. And the Committee to Save has been looking into the possibility of utilizing the reservoirs for some sort of a new project with the new thinking, because the state or the feds have mandated that we clean up our water runoff that's in the curbs, which now just goes into the LA River, and they want it to be cleaned before it goes into the LA River. It doesn't go through the sewer system. So, as has happened in the last 20 years, the technology for utilizing a place to keep dirty water in quotes, and clean it, have gotten much smaller. So there's a possibility that we may want to have a very small filtration plant somewhere in there, and then utilize Silver Lake as kind of a holding area. We want to do this because we want to make it useful as well as decorative. There's a vocalized fear that if all this is a view lake, that it's vulnerable. And I tend to agree with that. That the city someday could say, we just can't do it this anymore, and goodbye. So while we have a huge constituency of people who live right around it who are very committed to keeping it, there's only so
Who
much.
knows?
Who knows, right?
Right.
So if we could make it useful as well as decorative, then we think we have a better chance. And that's kind of, none of us on the committees are engineers. And it's kind of a new field, this reclaimed water field. So we're hoping that a little more time goes by and we get maybe some seed money to send some feelers out, somebody who could develop a plan and figure out how it could be done.
So how many, that was really wonderful, thank you.
That's 20 years in 10 minutes, right?
Right. So the committee right now is, how many people on the board for the Committee to Save the Reservoir?
Let's see, I think we have 15 on the Committee to Save and maybe 10 on Residents Association. There are probably 5 or 6 people who participate a lot with the Department of Water and Power. Meetings and stuff like that. And then there are other things, there are fundraisings and planning and development issues and abandoned cars and parking and all the other issues then.
Yeah, the committee itself needs to sustain itself with some kind of a budget.
Oh, absolutely.
Right, to do its work.
Right.
And are those members elected to the Committee to Save? Or are they
The
volunteers?
Committee to Save are volunteers, and it is not a membership organization. So in order to be a board member, there's a procedure that we go through, and we tell people how much work it is, and usually that discourages them.
And there is, I assume, some kind of a volume of records of history
absolutely.
up to now.
Yeah, right.
And
Minutes.
you kind of assume you'll be functioning in the future, maybe
Right.
another 10 years or so? Or?
Yeah, we've just started this discussion, like where will we want to go? If the Department of Rec and Parks takes over the management of the meadow, which is the most likely scenario, they have a procedure called the Park Advisory Board, and there would probably be a Park Advisory Board established to deal with the meadow issues. Whether or not the Committee to Save wants to participate with that aggressively, or we've just begun that discussion. Since the fight is over, we do need every once in a while to have strategic planning meetings and figure out what we're going to do and what people want to do. And if we were to look back 10 years at the strategic planning, the issues were all different because the fight was still on. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens.
And basically the Silver Lake Residents Association, part of its function is to ally itself with the Committee to Save.
But when we're talking about reservoir issues, the Committee to Save absolutely takes the lead.
And you're the president of the Residents Association and a board member of the Committee to Save.
Right.
So you're kind of a liaison in that sense.
Right, and it works nicely that way. So.
And what else, thank you for that.
Yeah.
And what else is the committee, the Silver Lake Residents Association doing?
Always planning. I sit on the urban planning committee for the Silver Lake Neighborhood Council. And the current chair, Elizabeth, is just absolutely terrific. And then there's the ongoing issues, the traffic, the trash cans, the trash, the abandoned cars, all the usual community issues that have been handled. As a project, I would say that the two key things that occupy the time of the Residents Association are the reservoir and planning. And those are kind of determined to be the most critical issues. And as people have energy and time and they want to work on something, then it happens.
And can you just tell us something about your strategic plan? I mean, you're still planning to retire and so on. Why don't you tell us what you do?
Right. In my real life,
you're the paying life.
My paying life. I'm a real estate agent. I work for Housing Solutions, and there are just 3 of us, so it's a small boutique real estate company. Each of us works out of our home. Been doing that for almost 20 years, hard to believe. And enjoy it a lot. I work with buyers primarily. I do have occasional listings. And because I have so much experience with buying and fixing and selling and building, and married to a designer who's always working on projects, I think I educate buyers more than some or most. So I have no intention to retire. We're not planning to leave Silver Lake. We have this discussion every once in a while when the traffic just gets too unbearable. And my husband was born and raised in Hollywood, so he's a California native, and I won't let him retire. And so that's what we do.
And stay involved. You kind of
stay involved. Yes, right. I think I probably hit the wall about 6 months ago and have backed off from a lot of stuff. Just, I got tired. 20 years of fighting, I got tired. So I haven't been doing as much the last 6 months or so, but we'll see what happens. It's kind of an ebb and flow. My husband and I like to do other things besides community. He says I do all the community work. He just supports me. And he'll show up when he needs to. If we need a body, he'll be there. So we like to go birding and bicycling and camping. We haven't done that this year at all. It's so sad. And traveling. I mentioned we just got back from a trip to New York. And so we like to do that sort of stuff. We like to cook. We have a beautiful kitchen with a beautiful view. So we like to cook.
Let me just say very clearly, the community thanks you for everything. Did you, I know you have another appointment and I do too.
Yeah.
Did you bring some things for us to put on camera?
No, I have nothing. I don't have any pictures. I did look through here and I don't have any pictures.
Okay.
And I think the thing, these memories of Silver Lake, we certainly got off on the reservoir issue, which is an important issue, but the things that I really like about the neighborhood is its eclectic mix. When we first moved to California, when I was 15, we moved to the West San Fernando Valley, which is very much not like Silver Lake. It's very flat, very tract, lots of identical houses, and
Homogeneous.
very. And at the time I lived there, not at all ethnically mixed. So I graduated from high school, and I worked for a couple years in the aerospace industry. And you work under contract. When the contract's finished, you get laid off. So I said to my mother, I said, the next time I get laid off, I'm going to see if I can find a job downtown. I want to live in Los Angeles. This isn't Los Angeles. This is Woodland Hills. So she was horrified, of course, and her first reaction was, you'll be killed. But no, I had this urban thing in me, and I found a really nice job downtown, and I got an apartment in Larchmont. I was there for 7 years, and then moved to Silver Lake, and then we bought and fixed and sold a bunch of houses, and ended up where we are. And we actually took a 6-week driving tour up the coast, all the way to Vancouver, to make a decision about whether or not we were going to build this house to live in, or we're going to build this house for spec. And I said to my husband, I said, if we're going to build this house for spec, I want the divorce before. Because I still want to like you. See, I don't want to have to wait until we hate each other and then get a divorce. So I was keen to build it to live in. And I think he, as much as he would have liked to have built it for spec, to do it that way, I think ultimately he realized that I was right.
Well, he grew to love it.
He grew to love it, yeah. No, it wasn't that he didn't like it or as a set. Yeah, he just wanted, to do that, and so I prevailed. And so now we're 20 years later, and it's a fixer. So we've got a new roof and a new air conditioning and a new dishwasher. We're getting decks and all kinds of things. So,
there's not much you can do with your house that isn't noticed by the entire neighborhood.
Absolutely, we're getting new decks.
Oh, look, they're putting in a new air conditioner.
Right, absolutely. So since it's going to have a complete refurbishment, because we're going to have to paint, carpet, and do all those things, we'll probably have another open house.
So do you have, a favorite activity in Silver Lake or restaurant?
Actually, watching all those people walk on that path is like kinetic art every day. And I see moms with strollers and jogging with those jogging strollers, and people pushing people in wheelchairs, and kids on trikes and kids on bikes, and people walking and talking. What the people who are on the path don't realize is that sound from that path carries up, and we can frequently overhear conversations. And of course, the new development is cell phones. So you can hear cell phones and people talking on it, and they tend to talk louder on their cell phones, so we can hear them. And I never forget the first night we slept in the house 20 years ago. And that was when people walked in the street, and it was like 3 in the morning, and we heard these two people. And it's at that time when it's so quiet, it sounded like they were in the house. We got used to it, and we could tell the difference. Obviously.
Never thought of that.
Yeah.
Never thought of that. And then the new development was when the path was in place. Decomposed granite has a different sound. Has this kind of scratching sound as people jog.
I love that sound.
It's wonderful. So I would say that other than the view and the trees and all that, watching this parade. I'll tell one funny real estate story, and then we'll finish. Very good client of mine acquiesced to her husband's wish to buy a house with a tennis court. I mean, there are only 6 of them in Silver Lake, and they were living in Silver Lake at the time. But none of them were for sale or whatever. And they ended up buying a house in Sherman Oaks. And she said to her husband, okay, I'll do this, but when you're done with tennis, or when we're done with tennis, we move back to Silver Lake. And he said, okay. So 7, 8 years goes by, and they're done with tennis. And so we begin to look for a house, and they're older. And so she wanted a 1-story house, or a house that would accommodate an elevator, which is not so easy to do. But there are some. B. Gold's got an elevator, and Jim Bonner's got an elevator. And so it can happen. So she said, when we first started looking, she said, well, we can expand into Los Feliz, as long as I'm close. Back to the hills. She hated the flats. So there are many one-story houses in an area called Los Feliz Estates, which was a tract that was built in the 60s, I think. And it was terraced just like they do in the San Fernando Valley, unlike what they did in the 20s in Los Feliz and in the Oaks. And so I would holler up there to look at every house that was for sale, and after about the third or fourth house, and the house was perfectly acceptable, one story, big tall ceilings, nice open space. She said to me, "Can we not come back here again? It feels like somebody set off a hydrogen bomb. There are never any people out. I want to be where the people are out." She said, "I never thought of it, but people are always out in Silver Lake, out walking their dogs, whatever." So that's where we ended up. We ended up in Silver Lake. But I thought that was very addictive.
We're out of tape.
Okay.
Okay.
We're out of
Thanks,
tape.
Mary Ann.
All right.